Welcome to the Tough Decisions Network for Entrepreneurs. I'm Dan Hanford, and my wife, Danae, and I interview successful people sharing stories behind tough decisions that they've had to make along their journey as an entrepreneur. Before we get started, let's hear from one of our sponsors. Have you ever thought about investing in real estate, but find yourself so busy that you don't have time for it? Do you have FOMO, which is the fear of missing out? At HanfordCapital.com, we help investors with passive real estate investments that project better returns than traditional investment vehicles such as the stock market. If you'd like to find out more about our passive real estate investments, visit HanfordCapital.com. That's HANDFORD Capital.com. We will jump on a call with you to discuss your investment goals and to see if our investments are a good fit for you. This advertisement is not to be construed as an offer or recommendation to buy or sell a security. Visit HanfordCapital.com. On the podcast with us today is Patrick Fitzgibbons. He is a police officer of 21 years in Colorado, and he is a current operations commander in the organization. He's also the host and creator of the top-ranked criminal justice podcast called CJEvolution. Welcome to the podcast, Patrick.
Hey, Dan and Deanne, thank you for having me on. It's an honor.
Yes, thank you for being with us. And I want to see if you can give us just a little bit more detail as far as your background goes and kind of tell us what led you to start the podcast and how you got going with that and how it's going.
Real quick bio of me. I grew up in Colorado for the most part. I was a military brat a little bit in my earlier days, and we were stationed overseas in Germany. My dad was in the Army. He was a lawyer in the Army. Moved to Colorado when I was about 10. Myself joined the military when I was about 21. Did 4 years in the Army, jumping out of perfectly good airplanes. Realized that I wanted to become a cop. I always had that kind of interest as a teenager, so came back to Colorado with my wife, started a family, went to the academy, and I've been a cop for 21 years. And like Dan said in the intro, I'm currently an operations commander. That means I'm in charge of all the patrol officers on the street. And like I was talking to Dan a little bit before we started, I've been doing my podcast for about 2 years. And I remember a couple of years ago saying, there's not a lot of people out there in the criminal justice field doing podcasts. And I just started, learning myself how to do it. And yeah, here we are 2 years later. I just recorded my 214th episode yesterday.
Wow, that's a lot of episodes in 2 years.
Yeah, I try to push at least 2 out a week. Yeah, it's great, Dan and Deanne. I mean, it's with technology like we're doing right now. I mean, it's now more than ever. It's so easy to do things on your own. So,
and as podcasts continue to get more and more popular, they're starting to grow across the world as well. We've done interviews from people, in Singapore and New Zealand and Australia and the Middle East and Canada, all over the place are now starting to really take off in podcasting. Mm-hmm. And it's amazing when I log into our podcasting platform and I see how many countries of people all across the world actually get to listen in and actually participate.
Yeah, it truly is amazing. And the one thing that, and you both have probably seen this right now, is that it's so easy to connect with people that you want to invite on your show. It amazes me to this day where I've had New York Times bestselling authors on my show, other leaders, leaders within the criminal justice field, but it's so easy to connect. Now, not everybody, comes on my show that I invite, but a vast majority, it's just a matter of reaching out to people, and most of them say yes. So it truly is amazing how you can connect with people these days, much easier than days past.
Well, and we're in this information age and content is king. And I think the more we can provide and the more people can listen in and actually participate, is really important.
Yeah.
So let's kind of, dive a little bit into, some of the tough decisions that you've made along your journey in the criminal justice field, but, maybe some of the tough decisions that you've made along creating this podcast that you have as well. And I like to kind of start off first with, a tough decision that you had that did not turn out so well. So, we'll get into the more positive one. But I want to talk first about one that I like to call like the sore thumb tough decision, if you will, where you made a decision and it didn't turn out the way you wanted. And it really, kind of still to this day, you're continuing to learn lessons from that tough decision.
So professionally, I mean, I'm in charge of a bunch of officers, and I've been fortunate in my organization to rise through the ranks. And, during that progression, Dan, I mean, I've grown up in the profession with a lot of friends, and I've been in the position where I had to let go people that I've been close with, coming up the ranks, and for a couple different reasons. But those are tough decisions when you're in a position where, you both are entrepreneurs. I'm sure you've done that before, where you've had to let people go from a job. And so I don't have anyone in particular. Well, actually I do, but I don't want to talk about it.
You don't have to mention any names about them.
Yeah. But those always very tough decisions. I mean, the higher, and again, speaking to the choir with both of you, the higher you go up in an organization, or maybe you're an entrepreneur, it's all about people. It's all about interpersonal skills and building those relationships. And unfortunately, sometimes those relationships go south, and you have to make some tough decisions. But that's just part of the growing process. It's part of life. As far as the podcast goes, I mean, the toughest decision I've had or recently with my podcast is, filling time and trying to get, it's just time management a lot with me. I'm a full-time police officer. I'm the third in charge of my organization. So it's a matter of juggling time and making those tough decisions. And yeah, those are really, tough decisions I have to make sometime, but I'm having a great time. I'm doing what I love in both fields, both in podcasting and law enforcement. And maybe one of these days when I retire, I can devote more time to the show.
So Patrick, as far as your podcast is concerned, when you started it, did you have something particular in mind, and has that come to fruition in the way that you thought it would, or is it a lot different than the way you planned it to be? And along with that, where do you get most of your listeners? Are they also involved in the criminal justice field, or do you get a lot of just curious people wanting to listen?
Great question. One of the things that I wanted my show, I wanted it to be unique. I wanted it to be a little bit different. There's a couple cops out there doing criminal justice shows, and they're all great shows, but I wanted mine to be unique in the fact that I wanted people outside of the criminal justice field to be on the show, leadership experts. I have people that talk about, finances, which is applicable to whatever business you're in. I have people that talk about emotional wellness, which is so important. So my podcast, I believe, is unique in that respect, because when I first started it, again, I just didn't want to, sit around and tell cop stories. I mean, those are fun, but I'm not to minimize it and say that's not important. They're all important, but my show is unique because I bring in, guests that talk about all these different things that are so applicable to law enforcement. I had a guest on, Guy Winch, who's a New York Times bestselling author. He's a famous psychologist in New York City. He was on a couple of days ago, and we talked about emotional wellness, and that's applicable to no matter what you're doing out there, and how to take care of yourself and how to be in tune with your emotions, because that's one thing that I think a lot of us, we don't take care of. We don't take care of our emotional well-being the way we should.
What are some of the things that you've done strategically with your time management that has allowed you to be able to do this podcast? I think, there's some people listening right now that are maybe, listening to what you're doing right now with the Criminal Justice Evolution podcast, that CJEvolution, as well as, with our podcast here. I'm in a little bit of a different space because, Danae and I, we don't work for somebody else, but, you're in a position where you're working for somebody else and you're also doing a podcast at the same time. So can you share with us a little bit, about what are some of the things that you've done to be able to allow you to be able to do your podcast, even though you're working full time?
Well, it's an evolution, no pun intended. It keeps evolving. It's just a matter, Dan, about, okay, I know most of the time I'm on a clock. I know, I have to devote, obviously my 9-to-5 job, and that's very important, but I know, have a good idea of what that time's going to look like during my day. And, I try to really, really map out my day as best as I can. But I also make time for the most important thing, and that's my family. That's my wife. That's my children. We're empty nested pretty much now. So it's my wife and I, but I do kind of juggle those. And my wife is the most important person in my life, as well as my kids. So yeah, it is a juggling act, but it just came with time and fine tuning. And some days, things go, I have to cancel a podcast, and that's just life. And I apologize to my guests, and they get it. But yeah, it's really just comes down to habits and discipline with me.
And do you sometimes have to schedule your podcast interviews during that 9-to-5 time? Then you have to make up the time by either coming in early or going in late or things like that to kind of juggle things sometimes?
It's a great question. And I'm in a unique position, Dan, where I work 4/10s. I work Monday through Thursday. I'm usually off I go in pretty early, around 6:30. I'm usually off by about 4 or 5. And then I usually try to schedule my podcast after those days during the week. And I'm also, I work, Monday through Thursday. So I have Friday through Sunday off. So I'm lucky where a lot of guests come on during the weekend and that Friday. So it's easier to juggle.
Did you ever have any pushback from your employer on you doing this podcast?
No, they love it. I mean, it's good exposure. Look, I'm not, bashing law enforcement. I'm not doing anything to embarrass my agency or, I love being a police officer. I'm a a strong proponent of the brave men and women out there that are in this very tough profession. And I can understand what you're saying. It's a fine line with some people, but they love it. I bring a different perspective. We talk. We have some great guests in law enforcement that make officers think. So I've never had a problem with it.
What do you do when you're facing a tough decision? Do you have a specific strategy that you employ when you're faced with a tough decision?
Well, in law enforcement, it's kind of like, I've spent most of my adult life in a uniform, whether it was in the military, the majority of it being in law enforcement. And sometimes you have to make those quick decisions. You have to go into that autocratic role, Deanne. But most of the time I found that, whenever I'm faced with a tough decision, look, I don't know everything. I don't want to be the smartest guy in the room, but I try to get feedback from people around me, whether it's peers, subordinates, because I'm just a big believer that the more you talk to other people, the more you're going to learn. You get different sets of eyes on a different problem. But like I said, sometimes I have to make a decision, a very quick decision, but most of the time I like talking with other people. I'm a big meditation guy. I love meditating in the morning. Try to do it every morning. Get up early and meditate, journal, which I find is, very important. But a lot of times it's just collaboration when you're making a tough decision. In my experience and in my life, 90% of the time, 95% of the time, you have time on your side. You can collaborate to come up with a better decision or get more ideas.
Yeah. So one of the things that I wanted to ask you too about your criminal justice background is obviously you're doing this podcast. You're the operations commander in your organization there in Colorado. So you have obviously seen some tough decisions that people in law enforcement have to make on a day-to-day basis. Can you share with us maybe one or two tough decisions that law enforcement officers have to make on a regular basis that you seem to kind of have as a running topic or a running theme in your podcast?
Well, we talk a lot about use of force issues. When officers have to resort, to any type of use of force, that can be, using a taser, that could be pointing a gun at somebody, that can be discharging a firearm in the line of duty. And those are also, very tough decisions for the officer to make. I've been on, those situations on the street, when I was a young patrol officer. And those are very tough decisions, Dan. Some people, it's easy to look back and kind of do things in hindsight, and say, well, from my view, and I saw the video, looks like the officer screwed up. Those are tough decisions for those people in those positions at that time. So it's very easy to get caught up in the hype and very easy to say, well, the officer shouldn't have done this and that. And there are bad instances out there that the officers have made horrible mistakes. But, it's very hard to put yourself in those positions unless you've been there before. So those are always tough decisions, just to remind people that the officers are faced with every day. And luckily, most police officers, they'll never pull their gun in the line of duty. They'll never discharge their weapon in the line of duty for their entire careers. Most officers never do that. So those are always tough decisions for officers to make out in the field.
Well, and it's interesting that you talk about that too, because, when you talk about a tough decision, we sit back and we go, well, when you have this tough decision, you need to think about it. You need to pray about it. You need to meditate on it. Sometimes, you just want to talk to other people and, that's a tough decision where you don't have that luxury to,
No.
Hold on, Mr. Criminal,
Yeah.
Stand there right there for just a minute. I got to call my commander up and ask him what I should do,
Yeah, that's a good point. And those are those split-second decisions that, hopefully we're training our young officers to do the right thing, make good, decisions. But officers are human, Dan. I mean, they're going to make mistakes. But yeah, it's a very good point that you made. Yeah, we don't have time. They can't call me up in the middle of something and they say, hey, should I do this? And I want them to be safe. I want them to make the best decisions they can and just trust in themselves. I mean, that's the thing too. We trust our officers. Are they going to make mistakes? Yes. Hopefully they're not terribly bad mistakes. But yeah, you're exactly right. The officers don't have time to make those calls to their commanding officers or superior officers or even their peers when they're in that split-second decision-making process.
And I think of that as kind of a tough decision as being an instinctive tough decision. It's you can train on that all you want. You can try to educate them and go through different classes or courses or even some role playing on those particular tough decisions when those things are encountered. But when it's in real life, it's a totally different game.
Yeah, exactly. And, time slows down and all those different things. And the one thing I always tell people is, because I teach too on the college level, I haven't been doing it much lately, but I taught for many years. And one of the things I told students or would tell students is be critical. And we need to be held to a high standard. That's just part of the job in law enforcement. But I always give this example of, when you see a video or something on YouTube and you're quick to make a decision, think of this. How many times do, officials in the NFL watch a replay and they're looking at every different angle, every different camera that is on that field, and they're sometimes it's just a matter of an inch or so whether somebody's foot was in bounds. In law enforcement, we don't have that luxury. Most of the time we got one shot. That's it. So,
and then many times you're making a decision as to whether it's going to be your life or theirs.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a tough business, but we're doing a good job, and I respect and love all those brave men and women out there who are doing it.
So, Patrick, can you maybe recommend to our listeners a book or a resource that has helped you with how you make decisions?
I have so many great books out there. What I would recommend, I just picked up a book called Principles by Ray Dalio. And I don't know if you two have ever heard who Ray Dalio is. A lot of people haven't. He's a very successful businessman. He's a hedge fund manager, made a ton of money. But it's not about the money. It's about the road that he took to become successful and the decisions that he made throughout his life, some good, some bad. But it was a learning process along the way. So I would encourage everybody to pick up this great book. I'm about halfway through, called Principles by Ray Dalio. And it's a great book. Good read.
So my question to you next is, at this point, you've been doing the podcast now, you said 2 years. Is that right?
Yeah.
Have you started to monetize that podcast and try to bring any revenue off of it, or is it still just information based?
My wife asks me that every day, Dan. When are you going to start bringing money in? No, and to answer your question, no. I mean, I guess I have this view. I want to make a buck just like anybody else, but I just have this view. Like if you're doing what you love, the money will come eventually. I mean, I've been blessed to have this growing podcast. It's growing exponentially every day. I have some sponsors that I have now that are, or more partners, not making any money, but I've kind of, you probably know how it works. I have a banner of a business on it's kind of a quid pro quo kind of thing, but I'm not making any money, but I will someday. But that's not my main focus. My main focus is, good content out there for the listeners and having a great time with what I'm doing. I would like to write a book one of these days down the road. And of course, I want to be the number one podcast for the criminal justice professional out there. So I'm working on it.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's a great goal to have. So far, have you started to maybe get any additional speaking engagements or anything like that? Or is it kind of hard to do that right now because you're still working full time?
I'm still working full time. And that's a great question. It's amazing because I just had a speaking engagement come up. We're still in kind of some negotiations, but I might be doing a speaking engagement down for the University of Colorado in Denver, talking about some criminal justice topics. And, they're interested in my podcast too. So I get invited to other podcasts all the time. I get invited to, of course, your podcast. And I have 2 more invites in my inbox that I'm going to respond to when I'm done with this. So I love it. It's a good time.
That's awesome. Well, let's shift gears here just a little bit. And, I want to talk about the most exciting thing that you have done with the money you've made up to this point in your career, or exciting place that you've traveled.
Oh, geez. My wife and I love Mexico. We love going down there. When I was a little kid, I was blessed. I was a military brat. I traveled a lot. So I got that out of my system at a very young age. I worked on a cruise ship when I was a kid, 18, 19. So traveled all up and down the West Coast, East Coast, Bahamas. So I've been to a lot of places in my short life. Well, I'm not that young anymore. I'm kind of old, but yeah, we love Mexico. Of course, I love the finer things in life. I just bought some brand new golf clubs, which I love. I'm a golfer. So, invest and try to save money. So
that's awesome. And what's one of the items that's on your bucket list right now?
New York Times bestselling author.
That is awesome. I think that would be a good thing to put on our bucket list as well. Danae and I are both in the process of writing a book right now. Mine's on relentless implementation and hers is on?
Mine is on how to love your entrepreneur.
There you go. And I'm a firm believer in visualization, guys. I mean, the more you visualize it, the more it'll come true. I really believe that.
Well, thank you so much for taking some time to be on the podcast with us today, Patrick. How can our listeners reach out to you and maybe, check out your podcast or try to follow you a little bit more?
The easiest way is I'm on Instagram and Twitter, but you can find all those links on my podcast, CJEvolution.com. You'll see all my episodes right there. You'll see Twitter, you'll see Instagram, iTunes. So that's the best way to reach me.
Well, thank you very much, Patrick. I wish you the very best and hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you both for having me on. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Tough Decisions Network. Be sure to visit toughdecisions.net to gain access to show notes for this episode and to join our free weekly entrepreneur email where we will send you news about the latest technology for your business, inspiring quotes, and the latest books for entrepreneurs. That's toughdecisions.net.